right. Hello, everyone. Um, in this episode, we're basically going to go into the Scrum Guide and try to understand the basics a little bit in depth and to be a little bit more specific towards Scrum itself rather than just any role or any type of Agile. Today, we have Gareth, our first guest, coming back. Hi, Gareth. And
Hello.
Andre, our main host. I'm going to be taking the role of kind of the newbie, going through the Scrum Guide and asking silly questions, and hopefully we'll get some insightful conversations going. All right. Well, starting with the Scrum Guide, which we will put the link in the description. It's free online for everybody to access. I think it's worth mentioning that. Latest update was November 2020, and let's just jump into it with the purpose of the Scrum Guide to begin with. How strict in terms of do you need to use it as a framework, and how or in your experience, and how often is it being kind of used, maybe to its 50%, maybe kind of almost bastardized to an extent?
I've definitely seen it used in a, what do they call it, like zombie scrum approach, where people are following the, I was going to say following the framework, following that, they're basically holding the events. So as we'll find out later on, there are a number of events that happen uh, for the team to enable the team and other stakeholders to get together and do specific pieces of work. I've certainly seen teams just following that, but really not entering into the spirit of why we do it.
I think the term that I hear a lot more than zombie scrum, I think it's scrum but. We're using scrum, but we're not using this or we're not using that. So basically, they're doing scrum but, and I'm looking at the second paragraph mostly because it says changing the core design or ideas of Scrum, leaving out elements or not following the rules of Scrum covers up problems and limits the benefits of Scrum, potentially even rendering it useless. So I guess the question is, how strict do you need to be implementing the framework, and do you need to follow all of it, or what are the elements that perhaps you can leave out to still be able to call it Scrum or still do Scrum, or are there any elements that you can drop?
Well, it does say that, doesn't it? Each element of the framework serves a specific purpose. And I guess it's a bit like, I mean, it's called a framework, isn't it? So if you're building a house, modern building, I'm not a modern building expert, but I see houses being built and there's a wooden framework. You can see where the walls are, you can see where the roof is, and then they build things around the framework. That's how I kind of see Scrum. It has the essentials. You've got the walls, you've got the door, you've got the roof, you've got the floor. If you remove any of that, is it still a house? Is it still usable? But you could use the same framework to build different styles of houses. The internals, the stairs could be, you know, circular. Is that what they're called? Spiral
Yeah, yeah.
stairs, or a stair lift, or you could. There's things that you could add to it. There's things that you could replace it with, maybe, but so long as they're they're
Hmm.
they're doing the same job, there's definitely a lot of opportunity for teams and companies and groups to customize it to their own needs and to bring their own elements into it. But there still has to be an integrity to the framework.
Yeah, I think that's nicely said. And I think, yeah, we're gonna explore bit by bit then what comes
And
next.
yeah, and I think we're gonna come back to it because I also want to put it the opposite. Is I've met people that use the Scrum Guide almost as a Bible to almost a destructive extent. And I know it says kind of changing the core design or ideas of Scrum, but it's see how rigid it is. But I think we need to go through the Scrum Guide and then maybe come back to that idea later.
Yeah, and we were discussing before we recorded Jeff Sutherland's book Scrum. He's one of there's his name, Ken Schwaber and Jeff Sutherland, and he talks about that Japanese shuhari framework technique for learning, um, which is basically first learn the rules and the forms, and then once you've mastered them, make innovations of your own, and then when you've done that, you then basically let go of the rules, and you just are just be the form that you're learning, and he has that pretty early on in his book, and I think that to me is a guide to how we should use this with our should we how we should use this with our teams. You start with the forms, you just follow the rules and learn the processes, learn the ideas behind it, and just try to understand what we're trying to do. And then once you've done that, start making innovations, start mastering it, and then you get to a point when certainly the teams that there's one team in particular I've worked with that were just fantastic. They just you didn't have to remind them about anything or whatever. They just were. They just did things and they thought in this way.
So it might be that it's more a beginner's guide to Agile or a beginner's guide to kind of Scrum. As the more experience you get, the more you can afford to maybe take a few steps away and maybe start experimenting and maybe start innovating, as you put it.
Yeah.
We'll go past the table of content. The Scrum definition.
I like that it says not often enough we refer to the increment as value, and I like that it says generate value. And I think that's what we strive towards, value, rather than say, yeah, let's release every sprint, let's release working software. That doesn't necessarily mean value, though.
But that also is a little bit subjective, especially for new people. Can you maybe define value a little bit more, or kind of how to determine if something is valuable?
So where does it go to? I think that's how you determine value. So a product is going to be used by the end user. Find out who the end user is, and then that's how you establish value. And you do that incrementally, and you do that by small iterative flows, small iterative releases of value, and then request the feedback from said user, and then improve and continue. The shorter the loop, the better it is most of the times. But if you're more comfortable and if you start understanding what you're doing and understanding what value is for the end user, then yeah, you can widen it a bit, but don't go overboard. Gareth, what do you think about this?
Well, I was going to say what's interesting is that you've jumped straight to software development, which is obviously what we are both involved in. But the previous was it paragraph 3 talks about them feeling humbled that Scrum's being adopted in many domains to do with complex work that's not just software development. So it's maybe also worth saying that you can use Scrum as a framework for um, any complex work, and I'm pretty sure it's a while since I've read Sutherland's book, but I'm sure he's got an example of when he had his house renovated. I like house metaphors, but he literally had his house renovated, and he used Scrum to speed up the process. So so they were constantly delivering small pieces of value each day, each week, until it was completed. I also really like that Scrum Masters get mentioned first in the Scrum Guide. So
Yeah, well, I guess because they have to, I guess, guide the environment and kind of guide everything else. They're the main ones, but
I don't think there's a main necessarily. I think Scrum counts on a Scrum Master to be a master for the framework and to make sure it's being implemented as good as it can. Because I think that's the main responsibility.
but yeah, it's the first, I guess. Well, first thing mentioned to basically it's an essential part of it.
yeah, and there's the answer to our previous question. Scrum is simple. Try it as it is, and determine if it works for you. So it is, and it's simple. It's simple to understand. It's pretty hard to
Master, kind of.
get right,
Yeah.
to master. Yeah,
Okay.
I like that challenge.
Perfect. The Scrum Theory.
So this is a lot to chew because
Yeah.
this is full of information right there. But one thing which basically I mentioned earlier is the iterative incremental approach, which basically optimizes predictability. Because that's exactly the opposite of what waterfall represented, where you would finish off a project just by yourself, well, as a team, within six months, 1 year, 2 years, who knows, and then maybe at the end the result is not as expected, or more often than not it wasn't as expected. So Scrum basically says use the sprint, it's a containing event, and make sure that within the sprint you deliver value to the customer. Again, the context is, and perhaps it's nice that Gareth mentioned it, and I think moving forward for us is going to be a lot easier to use our experience interpreting the Scrum Guide, and our experience, I think it's mostly software development in terms of using Scrum.
And I think, yeah, there's lots of stuff in here: empiricism, lean thinking. That iterative incremental approach is something that is really important, and something that, so one of the teams I worked in, we would often explain to our stakeholders that the importance of this iterative incremental approach, that at the end of each sprint we're going to, or even during the sprint, doesn't, these releases don't have to be at the end of the sprint, that each sprint we will iteratively develop something that you can use that brings new value. And the example that we often gave was, imagine you've got a customer, they want to, their problem statement is they want to get from A to B, they want to get to work in the morning, let's say, and they give us the requirements that it needs to carry them and a bag or whatever. Maybe the first thing that we build for them is a scooter, just a scooter that they move with their feet. It's 2 wheels, a stick, and something to stand on. That does the job. It's not what they want eventually, but we've built them something that works. And then the next sprint, maybe we put a little motor on that. It becomes a kind of motorized. They get there quicker. And then maybe the next sprint, we develop something that's more akin to a sit-on scooter, like a small motorbike, like a Vespa kind of thing. And then maybe we get to the point where we build them a full motorbike, and it's still, or a four-wheeled motorbike maybe. And it may actually get to the point where the customer goes, do you know what, this does the job for me. We thought we wanted a people carrier or an SUV or something, but actually now we've seen this has given us the value. So it's that iterative incremental approach to building things. So you're constantly developing value, and giving them something that they can use, rather than the old-fashioned way, which is what this is in response to, which was you give us all the requirements. We'll go away for months and build it and then deliver you something that they can't use it. They don't get the
Yeah.
value in that period where they're waiting.
Do you think that maybe it would add a bit to this section? It's not mentioned here. I know it's going to be mentioned later, but communication and especially feedback is a key part of that iterative incremental approach. Like you use the example going from a scooter onwards to eventually a 4x4, is every step of the way the final user, the final client, needs to give you the feedback in order to guide you and correct course in case you start kind of going off the path of what they actually need, not necessarily what they ask for.
I
Yeah,
think it
I was about
hints
to
at
say
that
that it
here.
hints in almost every sentence. uh, Empiricism asserts that knowledge comes from experience and making decision based on what is observed. That's one thing. The other thing is the pillars, which is transparency. So make sure the user sees what's happening and gets the result as early as possible. Inspection, uh, basically you can use the sprint review for example for inspection, where the user says, yeah, this is usable, or it should have two more wheels, because I'm using Gareth's example. I cannot drive a scooter, so it should have two more wheels. Or maybe the user says, yeah, I think scooter is exactly what I wanted. So maybe you advance to a car, and then he goes back and says, now thinking about it, scooter is exactly what I wanted. So let's evolve by going back to something that we had. So yeah, that's the inspection part. And adaptation, you adapt to the requirements. So yeah, there's quite a few places that you can interpret.
Interpret, yeah, but that's it. It lets you interpret it. It doesn't like outright explicitly say it, which it might be. Do you think it would add value to kind of just explicitly define? I guess we'll go this into a little bit later, but explicitly define the stakeholders' role in Scrum, the client or the end user's role.
Interestingly, the stakeholder isn't part of isn't one of the roles that's defined in Scrum.
We
Um,
should also look at, because this is something I thought about. How do you interpret what stakeholder is? And I think
Well, yeah.
we may get to that later on, or we can tackle it now.
but maybe as they said in the introduction, that they use the word developers not to exclude but to simplify. If they get value from Scrum, then they are part of the development team. Maybe that's where they're included.
I know it's from my kind of my perspective of a wider thing. I looked at the other thing is part of what the currently is going through a almost like a macro change in the whole economy, where it's going through stakeholder capitalism rather than shareholder capitalism, where before it was uh, a company or a project was only focused on maximizing profits for the people that own it. Stakeholder capitalism, in theory, is getting input from everybody that is affected by the project or the company. So I think stakeholder is maybe to some extent purposely left ambiguous and kind of wide, but well, I think as you hinted, it might be maybe bring quite a bit of value if they defined it at least in some basic aspects, in some basic regards.
Yeah, I mean, stakeholder is mentioned 13 times. I've just done a search. Um, and there are other. One of my backgrounds is DSDM, Agile Project Management, and they're very clear about what stakeholder means, and they give specific names to particular types of stakeholder. But there's just a simplicity to the Scrum framework that says basically, yeah, you've got the developers, the people that actually do the work, and then you've got the stakeholders who are the stakeholders. Define that as you
Mhm.
like for your particular situation.
I mean,
On we
yeah.
go. That seems to be their kind of
I
approach.
think it was before I became a Scrum Master, I was a business analyst. I remember part of that training was it defines stakeholders a little bit more, because you have to define each stakeholder and acknowledge kind of the relationship and the amount of feedback that you need to get from them, and amount of interaction that you need with them. So I think that might be. I don't have it anywhere like pulled up. I didn't think of that, but maybe for the next episode I'll pull that up, because it's kind of a table of how to define the stakeholders. That might be useful.
And there's nothing here that stops us using that. If,
Yeah.
if a particular organization has specific stakeholder groups, great, bring them in.
Yeah, perfect. As long as the organization knows, and the Scrum team gets to know what stakeholders means, then yeah.
Transparency, the pillars. So yeah, in this case, transparency is visibility. It's one thing that I've noticed in almost every single company that I worked with that is not agile. And like, I only worked with one agile company so far in my life, but everybody has that. Not everybody, but most people have that reflex of trying to hide the process and maybe show a little bit of results, of trying to focus on avoiding mistakes more than learning from mistakes, because the punishment for making mistakes is worse than the praise that you get when you get the results. So I think it's deliberately basically mentions and that transparency to try to eliminate that type of culture, that type of insulating culture. But how do you guys see transparency within Scrum?
Clearly, that was my transparency joke. I'll tell you a story. I worked in a web team. There were 3 of us in the team, and I had this niggling sense that we were working on more than we said we were working on. Why were things taking so long to get completed? So I grabbed a pen. I went over to our whiteboard, and I said, "What?" Because somebody had just said, "Oh, I'm working on this," and I was like, "Working on that? We haven't been working on that." And he went, "Oh no, I've been working on this for a few months now." So I just went, "Stop, let's." Right, what are you all working on? What are you working on? I wrote them up on the board. We had 24 projects in flight between 3 of us. And I just went, we didn't know about half of these, or more than half of these. And that was the beginning of us starting to use a kind of Kanban style approach of things to do, things in progress, things done. I know Kanban's a lot more complex than that, but just having that transparency of this is what we're currently working on gave us so much agency to tell our boss which of these are priorities, kind of work out our priorities. Just by doing that, just by showing and being transparent about the work that we're working on, had so many benefits. That it's definitely one of those things. Just a few weeks ago, I had a team that I was working with. Some bugs came up. Should we be transparent about those with our stakeholders? I said, well, absolutely, but there was this kind of, let's keep it quiet from them. So, kind of, there's lots of questions that come up about transparency, not just about showing the work, but also, like you said, being open about the problems that we find, and because sometimes those stakeholders are the key people that can help us resolve these things.
It's not just the problems. And one thing I want to add, which is exactly something that happened to me today, where someone was working on a task, and then there's trying to not give any details or too many details, but they were working on a task, and there was an adjacent task that should have happened at the same time as said task. So basically, the secondary task was nowhere on the board, and there was no visibility of the work that had to be done. And the team suggested, yeah, we'll just do it, because it was like a 1 hour task or maybe even less. But even something as small as that, if it happens often enough, uh, it reduces your, well, first of all, transparency, second of all, productivity and your capability to deliver value faster. So I think it's transparency can be interpreted in a few more ways, as Gareth mentioned. Don't hide your mistakes, because that happens. Don't hide your process, and also don't hide stuff that's actually happening, like small task which may only take you 1 hour, but at least you can say you're working on it.
An interesting
There's
thing there that is kind of just came to me, a trap that I think I fell in quite almost like deep into it, and it was, can't even remember how far away it was, but it was a culture almost of starting from school, in which it was, you get a certain task and you get the main praise that anybody gets is not about how well they completed the task given, but how well they've surprised everybody by creating, almost like they call it almost like going the extra mile, but it's not going the extra mile, it's creating a separate thing to to almost like build on top of the task, if that makes kind of sense. I think I might be not being clearly, but in terms of, you almost get ignore or kind of do the task at hand to a minimum degree and try to perform some other idea that you came at and put in a lot more effort into in trying to get praise for surprising or coming up with something that wasn't thought of beforehand. That type of environment, it it promotes this type of competition and this type of also kind of, okay, to give a more probably a more clear example, hopefully a more clear example, because I know this might not be be very clear. One of my first kind of almost business ventures, and I was in this with Andre, it was a production company, and we were looking at basically video editing software and video editing people. Coming into contact with somebody in my hometown that was more experienced in video editing, the advice that they gave me is, be very very careful of who I train and who I basically the work that I do, of showing too much of my work, because other people will learn and then take my place, almost like steal my customers and like outmatch me. And their advice was, guard your work carefully, don't show anything to anybody. And I think that type of environment, in which the main task that you do is kept a secret, and it's almost like only the excess things, the surprising kind of elements to your work are almost praised, it can lead you the wrong path or can become counterproductive in the long run. I don't know if you've ever come across something like that before.
I mean, you can also be careful here, because there's two ways you can interpret this. Uh, you should display your process and your status to the people that should actually know. And for example, the product owner should know what's happening, stakeholders should know the value you're delivering. But as a software development company, that doesn't mean that a competitor company should view the work that you're doing, your code, that you should expose your API to the public and all that. So it kind of also can hint towards that. So I don't really wanna. There's a
Yeah,
fine line between it.
it's not necessarily that what I, and definitely when I got that advice, it wasn't necessarily towards show them the details of maybe a project that I've been working, something that would be normally protected maybe by an NDA or something along that side. It was genuinely the knowledge that you've gained so far, the process itself, basically guard your skill set especially your skill set, carefully, which I think is not it's almost opposite to a agile basically mindset, an agile environment. Being able, well, I think we've saw it above in a little quite before. Sharing skills is part of agile, being cross functional, and that type of old school mentality where you basically learn one trait and guard it with your life, because that kind of guarantees your livelihood, is can end up quite destructive, and especially it can hinder your progress or your company's progress towards implementing Scrum.
I agree
Yeah.
completely. And the previous section on Scrum Theory talks exactly about what you just said, about, it's groups of people who collectively have all the skills required to do the work, and they share or require such skills. It's essentially the kind of special forces of Scrum development, of software development, or any kind of complex work, isn't it? You get the right people in the group with the right skills, and they support each other. They don't keep these things themselves. This whole transparency thing, I mean, you could do an entire episode on transparency. There's a fantastic book, Making Work Visible: Exposing Time Theft to Optimize Workflow, by Dominica de Grandis, if that's
we should put the references that we're mentioning. So both books that have been mentioned so far, let's also put them in the description of the video.
And she talks about 5 thieves of time: too much work in progress, unknown dependencies, unplanned work, conflicting priorities, and neglected work. So things that have been started but not finished. And she argues that by exposing all of this, making these things transparent, we can address all 5 of those major time thieves. I don't know. Yeah, and I've definitely worked with a couple of teams where we focused on that, because they were, unknown dependencies, things that other teams needed to do, or pieces of work that needed to be done before that piece of work could be started. Certainly, and unplanned work, things that just appear, like you've already said, and it's fine, it'll only take an hour, I'll do it. Conflicting priorities, that was that first team that I talked about. And neglected work, well, that was them as well. We'd started 23 other things, but we'd not finished them. Things just drag out. So making these things transparent solves a huge number of issues for teams.
I know I rambled on a little bit there. We lost a bit of time, but
that was good.
I'll move on to. We'll probably do the inspection and adaptation, and then we'll finish for this episode.
Basically, one thing that's happening is linking one thing to another. So transparency enables inspection enables adaptation. So they need to all function together. That's one remark which I want to say it up front. Not wait for the adaptation part to also be read.
Yeah, inspection without adaptation is understanding your problems and not doing anything about them.
It's pointless, as the Scrum Guide may call it.
I was just about to say that I think there's, and obviously inspection is important, but maybe it goes back to that early part about the Scrum Master's responsibility to foster an environment where these things happen, and part of that is about creating a psychologically safe space where people can honestly inspect these things. And I think maybe that's where some of that kind of zombie Scrum happens, in that they have these events, but actually, they inspect, but there is no adaptation, because there's a fear that if they say something, they will be ridiculed or victimized or punished or whatever. So yeah, there's an underlying culture required, an openness within the team to allow all the stakeholders, and that includes the developers, to point things out and go, this didn't go well. What can we learn from that? And having that kind of blameless culture where you can raise these things and have the right people in the room to resolve them. And I've seen that work fantastically, where we've had like the CEO of the company in a sprint review and explaining this didn't happen because there were other dependencies and we weren't aware of them. And by the time I got back to my desk in my office, it had been resolved because the CEO had been on the phone to somebody and said, make this happen. But that only happens if you've got that culture of complete transparency and openness and safety.
I think thinking about inspection, one thing that popped in my head is, I usually, when I read this before, I usually think about inspection that needs to happen in the software development company on the code. However, I think inspection needs to happen at all levels. So,
Yeah.
even as a Scrum Master, inspection is happening, but it's usually overlooked to some extent.
It's sometimes uncomfortable. It's kind of inspection is especially useful when you inspect your mistakes or your shortcomings or the things that need improving. So you need to get into that's safe mindset, as Gareth mentioned before, and it is uncomfortable, especially coming from a different environments. So in a lot of environments, well, mostly, I think in all environments, competition is healthy, but cutthroat competition can become toxic, where transparency gets shut down, inspection becomes a weakness, and you need to get out of that mindset of I need to win by any means necessary. It's just to get to a point where I need just accept that I need to be better than I was yesterday in order to allow yourself to inspect your own shortcomings and inspect your own defects, your mistakes, in order to lead to adaptation, which will be the next step.
And a commitment to carry out the things that we've learned.
Yeah.
We've learned that this isn't working, then let's change it, not just kind of put it on a list and go, well, we know that's not working. We tiptoe around it.
Right. And adaptation. Yeah. And I would especially like to ask about that second paragraph there about empowerment and self-managing. How many, like, I've been in so many situations, and I'd like to ask how you generally deal with, or how common do you find it, in which you have the transparency, you do have the inspection, you identify the mistake, make up a potential solution, but are blocked from implementing it because the decision or the end decision doesn't lie within the team. It needs to come from outside, either from upper management or middle management. There's that type of blocker that kind of gets in the way. Is that often in your experience? I know it is in mine. However, I've only worked in one agile company, so a lot of the more waterfall companies, it's almost to be expected. But even within agile companies, how empowered and self-managing are teams really, or how well do companies respect that those aspects of Scrum?
I think, in my experience, it depends. It depends very much on the company. I've The first place I used Scrum, we used that within a DSDM, Agile Project Management Framework, and part of that framework, very early on in the early aspect of the framework, you're expected to meet with the stakeholders and the key people, the people that hold the budget, the people that the managers that have the authority, and you get sign off from them that they will empower the team and they will help. They will allow them to make the decisions that they need to make. And I think that's definitely something that I would want to maybe bring into Scrum as a kind of prerequisite. When I first started using Agile, it was with XP, and one of the books that I read, one of the prerequisites was about getting that authority, that sign off from right at the top, and making sure that management were on board with what we were doing, and enabling them to empower the teams. Because without that, that just becomes another source of blockages, waiting for the authority to do things. And I'm a big believer in doing things and asking for forgiveness afterwards, when you've kind of proven it, or you've tried something and gone, yeah, well, that didn't work.
In terms of empowerment and self-managing this, I would pick them apart as two issues. I want to bring up again the idea of an outsourcing company, because especially in Romania, and for our listeners from Romania, they may feel less empowered as a team that's working for a client who pretty much has all the power, because basically they're paying for a team to develop their product. And when it comes to how much authority you have, it's not as much as within a company that's building its own product, because inevitably as a team you're closer to the stakeholders. I'm gonna call them, because it's a buzzword for now. uh, so I understand both sides. I've worked in both types of companies, and there is more empowerment when you're working on your own product, because the team also has a bigger stake in it. I think it has a bigger stake in it. But also, there's this other element where you don't need to fight all the sharks in the water, because perhaps there are a lot of changes and you adapt to most of them. Maybe some of them need re-evaluation, or maybe some of them are way too big. Because, for example, you may decide that, or you may think that, let's say you're using a mobile app, you're building a mobile app, and the team thinks that perhaps redesigning the UI UX is the best possible thing because they want to have a shiny app, but they are still too close to the thing to maybe see outside what's happening, because the user may not care if there's a special effect when you switch between tabs or screens or whatever. They care for the app to work, and maybe it doesn't work as well as it can. So empowerment to some extent, and it's also good to have that empowerment go two ways, because sometimes you may have stakeholders, sometimes you may have someone from the outside that says maybe you should work on this, or maybe you should rethink how you're doing things, and then make sure you offer that empowerment. So yeah, I think that's
No, that's a good point. That empowerment and self-managing are actually, they're put right next to each other, but I think for a purpose, because there's not that much overlap. Empowerment, in my experience, is rarer than self-managing. Companies, and from personal experience, you're given a very very short leash and are told to self-manage, but within a very tight kind of rule set of, you're not allowed to make changes, some very obvious changes that would need to be made, but you're not allowed to kind of go outside of those rules. So you're given a very small sandbox to self-manage within. uh, that can limit adaptation, but that happens a lot uh, more often than not. Because I would I don't think that you can have empowerment without self management, but at the same time, I do think you can have a little bit of self management without being empowered.
And it's also worth making clear that when it says self-management, it doesn't mean the team's allowed to do whatever they want to do,
Yeah.
however they want to do it. You know, this comes from the context of previous waterfall um, projects where the project manager defines the work and creates little work packages and hands that out to the developers, and they follow the instructions. They build exactly to the letter. This means it's the team's responsibility to break down the work, to understand the work, to break down the work, and decide themselves how they deliver it, how they create it, and how they deliver it. Now, within a certain organization, they may have, empowerment and authority just to use whatever technology they want. But most companies, you're going to have, you'll know this as a business analyst. There's political, there's economic, there's social, cultural, there's technological, there's legal, there's environment issues and factors that the team may have to, adhere to. Company cultural stuff, certain tools that they need to use, like version control or some project management style tools to make transparent their work, Trello, Jira, whatever. So there's self-management. It's not just a carte blanche permission to do whatever the hell they want. It's focused on it's how do they deliver that work, how they have the authority to decide who works on what within the team.
Yeah. And I just thought of an example that a more classical example that kind of contradicts what I just said. So kind of to contradict myself, you could technically have empowerment without self-managing, especially in a waterfall top-down organization like the military, where everybody has empowerment by their own role and their own rank, but you're not allowed to self-manage without your supervisor, or orders go down, but then you have every single rank has a whip to some extent to to use at their own leisure or their own, I guess, discretion.
I mean, I don't have military experience, but I've got friends who are in the military, and it seems to me that that's beginning to change, or has been changing, in that they are empowering. The command comes down, and they are empowering their people to do things. So that's a good thing.
Yeah.
But I think the last thing I would want to say about this section is that very last sentence. A Scrum team is expected to adapt the moment it learns anything new through inspection. And as we'll discover as we go further down, there is that retrospective event where at the end of each iteration of work, the team gets together, looks back at what they've done and says, what could we improve? We don't have to wait for that event.
Yeah.
If we spot something on day one of the sprint and go, this isn't working for us, change it. You're empowered to change it.
Yeah. No, that I think the last sentence of the first paragraph and the last sentence of the second paragraph almost like go hand in hand. The adjustment must be made as soon as possible to minimize further deviation. And a Scrum team is expected to adapt the moment it learns anything new through inspection. It goes back to the whole empowerment and self-managing. It effectively, you minimize the damage or the done. Basically, if you make a mistake and don't immediately see it, inspect it, and move away from it or correct it, you let one tiny mistake or deviation become larger problem, like a crack
I think
widens.
this is also, so it's incomplete to some extent because it does say a Scrum team is expected to adapt the moment it learns anything new. And you mentioned the retro, Gareth, but there are quite a few cases where it's best to leave it to the retro and just let things play out. Like one example I would give is, let's say you're working, you've picked too many items in the sprint, and you also set a sprint goal. Now, perhaps you may realize that there's a few too many. Now, you you are welcome to remove some elements perhaps, but don't endanger the sprint goal. However, you may want to say, okay, this is a battle that we want to fight in the sprint retrospective battle, because we keep doing this, we keep bringing in way too many things. So you're not necessarily adapting the moment you learn that, the moment you realize that. You are adapting after, I guess, even a week or just after a bit of time, because you're still playing by the rules. So you're still finishing the sprint and you're waiting for the retrospective, which we're going to get to in the next episode or episodes. And it's still a useful event to grab all the data that you've inspected throughout the sprint and make sure you use that time slot to adapt or to discuss, and then use the next sprints to adapt. So there's some truth in this, but there's also the other side of it.
I think that's definitely true for a newer team working with Scrum. I think sometimes teams need to fail to
Yeah.
learn. You know, they need to try things and go, yeah, that didn't work, and retrospect on it. I would definitely expect, and I've worked with pretty mature teams who've got to a point, 2 or 3 days into the sprint and gone, we've brought in far too much. Let's start taking things off. But I trusted them. You know,
That's fair, yeah. And we've talked to developers, I guess, in previous episodes where they've expressed frustration towards the retrospective, that kind of what you guys just brought up, that waiting until the formal event to fix a problem sometimes is just too late. It's just kind of so I guess that'll be a debate when we get to actually the retrospective. And
Yeah, I think it depends really. I doubt it will be a big debate, because it depends on how big the problem is, and it depends from team to team. It depends from person to person, how important
yeah.
something may be for you, and it may trigger you. So if it impacts your work, then go for it. Don't wait for the retrospective to share your concerns.
and
Yeah.
that's the number one response that I usually get when I bring to the rest of our Scrum Master team. What should we do in this situation? And the number one response is usually, it depends.
But defining those depends kind of scenarios will be quite useful. But we'll do that. Like, we've dragged this on. Look, we're an hour in, and we're quite, yeah. I think
Sorry.
we'll call it a day for now, and we'll do a second episode and walking through the second part of
You may
the
say
Scrum Guide.
that we'll inspect and adapt for the next episode. Together.
Yeah.
It's been a joy, though.
No.
Right.
Well, thanks, Andre. Thanks, Gareth.
Thank you. Until next time. Bye all.